In the winter of 1864, an Irish immigrant named James Irvine paid $18,000 for 49,000 acres of Southern California. That land, dry, covered in dying cattle, most of it cactus and wild grass, cost him roughly 37 cents an acre. Today, that same ground is controlled by a single man whose net worth exceeds $18 billion. Which means the value of what James Irvine bought has multiplied not by 10, not by 100, not by 1,000, but by something closer to 450,000. No stock, no bond, no barrel of oil, no ounce of gold has ever produced a return like that. And the strangest part isn't the number. It's that nobody, not Irvine, not his son, not his grandson, not anyone who ever held this land, ever intended to build a city on it. The city of Irvine, California exists because of a drought, a death nobody believes was a suicide, 1,000 acres sold for $1, and a man who once failed to qualify for the Olympic ski team. None of that sounds like it should produce the safest large city in America. But it did. Start with the drought, because that's where everything starts. In 1862 and 1863, California was hit with a dry spell that killed an estimated 800,000 head of cattle across the southern half of the state. The old rancho families, the Sepulvedas, the Yorbas, the descendants of Spanish and Mexican land grants, watched their herds collapse and their wealth evaporate. They needed cash. They needed it fast. And waiting in San Francisco was James Irvine, a man who had come to California in 1849 during the gold rush, worked the mines, worked a grocery business, and learned the first lesson of California wealth. You don't get rich pulling things out of the ground. You get rich owning the ground itself. Irvine and three partners, Benjamin and Thomas Flint and their cousin Llewellyn Bixby, moved quickly. They bought the Rancho San Joaquin, nearly 49,000 acres, from the desperate Andres Sepulveda for $18,000. 2 years later, in 1866, they picked up the Rancho Lomas de Santiago, another 47,000 acres, from the estate of William Wolfskill for $7,000. Then, in 1868, a court judgment handed them 4,000 more acres of the Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana. In 4 years, for a total investment of roughly $40,000, these four men had assembled 108,000 acres of contiguous Southern California land, stretching from the Santa Ana Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It was nearly a third of what would eventually become Orange County. And here's the fact that explains everything that follows. It was all one piece. Not scattered parcels, not separate investments. One unbroken expanse of earth held by one group, answerable to no one else. That single fact, that the land stayed whole, is the reason a city called Irvine exists today instead of another 20 miles of freeway exits and strip malls. In 1876, Irvine bought out the Flints and Bixby, becoming the sole owner. He ran sheep mostly. It was a plain operation on extraordinary land. When he died in 1886, his son, James Irvine II, inherited the entire ranch at the age of 19. There's a detail about James II that I love because it tells you something about the era and about the man. Shortly after learning he'd inherited 100,000 acres of Southern California, he and a friend climbed onto high-wheel bicycles in San Francisco and rode them all the way down to Orange County to inspect the property. That's roughly 450 miles on a penny farthing. He arrived, looked at his inheritance, and then did something that would define the ranch for the next 60 years. He diversified. He planted. He turned the Irvine Ranch from a sheep operation into one of the largest agricultural enterprises in California. Grains, vegetables, lima beans, citrus groves, walnuts. Miles and miles of lima beans, actually. Row after row of them, flat and green across the coastal plain. So many acres of lima beans that the region became known as a national center for them. And in 1894, He incorporated the whole thing as the Irvine Company. Think about what James Irvine II did not do. He did not sell. As Los Angeles exploded northward and westward through the early 20th century, as Orange County started to fill in around the edges, as developers came calling with bigger and bigger offers, James II held. This is the defining act of the Irvine story. Not building, but waiting. While his neighbors sold off parcels to subdividers and watched their ranchos dissolve into tract housing, James II poured money back into the land. He built a dam in 1929 and created Irvine Lake, anchoring a sophisticated irrigation system that turned formerly dry acreage into productive soil. He planted citrus orchards that produced revenue year after year. He donated 300 acres for a public park in 1897, the first regional park in Orange County, a gift that signaled something unusual about the way this family thought about land. They weren't just sitting on it. They were investing in the idea that wholeness itself had value, that the ranch intact was worth more than the sum of its sold-off parts. It was a contrarian bet, and for decades it looked like a foolish one. By the 1930s, the ranch was producing lima beans, Valencia oranges, avocados, walnuts, barley, and cattle. It employed hundreds of workers who lived in bunkhouses and company housing along what was called Foreman's Row. There was a warehouse by the railroad tracks, a small post office, a scattering of structures that constituted the town of Irvine. Not a city, barely a settlement, more like a company camp. In 1937, as if to ensure that his philosophy of holding would outlast him, James II created the James Irvine Foundation and transferred 51% of the company's stock into it. The foundation's charter directed that proceeds be devoted to charitable purposes in California. When James II died in 1947 at the age of 80, his bequest to the foundation was valued at $5.6 million. The ranch was intact, the land was whole, and nobody was building houses on it. His son, Myford Irvine, took over as president, and here is where the story cracks open. Myford was born in 1898. He married, divorced, remarried. He had a daughter. By most accounts, he was a quieter man than his father, less consumed by the ranch, but dutiful enough to run it. And then, on January 11th, 1959, Myford Irvine was found dead in the basement of his ranch home. The coroner ruled it suicide. The details of that ruling remain, to put it carefully, contested. Myford had been shot 3 times, twice in the abdomen with a 16-gauge shotgun, once in the temple with a .22 caliber revolver. He was right-handed. The shots appeared to have been fired with his left hand, 2 different weapons, 3 wounds, and the dominant hand unused. The coroner's verdict stands to this day, but members of the Irvine family have publicly doubted it for decades. No one has ever been charged with anything. The case has never been reopened. Whatever the truth, Myford's death in January 1959 removed the last member of the Irvine bloodline who might have resisted what happened next. Because 9 months later, the University of California came looking for land. The timing is uncanny. In 1957, the UC Regents had authorized the creation of a new campus in Southern California, and they'd hired an architect named William Pereira to scout locations. Pereira was not an ordinary architect. He'd helped design the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. He'd built movie theaters and sanitariums and research labs. He'd designed the Los Angeles International Airport Terminal. He was, by the late 50s, one of the most respected architects and planners in America, a man who had grown increasingly disgusted by what post-war suburban development was doing to Southern California. The sprawl, the chop, the way good land was getting sliced into lots and drained of any coherence. He looked at more than 20 possible sites for the new campus. He studied cities across southeast Los Angeles and Orange County. And then he stood on a hilltop on the Irvine Ranch, a hilltop surrounded by lima bean fields as far as he could see in every direction. And he knew. This was the site, not because it was the most accessible or the most developed, because it was the least, because it was empty, because it was owned by a single entity. Because a man could stand on that hilltop and imagine not just a university, but an entire city designed from scratch, without having to buy out 100 different owners or navigate a patchwork of competing zoning boards. Pereira later said the Irvine Ranch reminded him of the great European university settings, the contemplative space, the sense of place, the room to grow. He told the Irvine Company trustees he needed at least 1,000 acres for the campus. A trustee told him that would be impossible. But there was someone on the Irvine Company board who disagreed. Her name was Joan Irvine Smith, and she was the great-granddaughter of the original James Irvine. Joan was 26 years old, she was fierce, and she understood something that the older board members did not. A university would do for southern Orange County what UCLA had done for West Los Angeles. It would anchor everything. It would create value that no number of lima bean harvests could match. She lobbied, she argued, she built a coalition of local leaders. And in September of 1960, the Irvine Company transferred 1,000 acres of its ranch to the University of California. The price was $1. There was a clause in the company charter that said real property could not be donated to a public entity, so the dollar was technically a sale. But everyone understood the truth. Joan Irvine Smith had just convinced one of the largest private landholders in American history to give away a piece of itself. That dollar bought what would become UC Irvine. 4 years later, the Regents purchased an additional 500 adjacent acres. And by then, William Pereira was already doing something far more ambitious than designing a campus. He was designing a city. In 1960, the Irvine Company converted the old Irvine family mansion into offices and gave them to Pereira. He moved in and began working on a master plan, not just for the university, but for 10,000 acres surrounding it. The concept was radical for its time, though it would have been recognizable to Ebenezer Howard, the English planner whose Garden City diagrams Pereira had studied closely. The university would sit at the center like a hub. Radiating outward would be residential villages, each with its own school, park, and shopping center, connected by green belts and bicycle paths. Industrial and commercial zones would be placed deliberately, buffered from homes, positioned to generate tax revenue without intruding on daily life. Open space, real open space, not leftover scraps, would be protected permanently. The streets would have landscaping allowances built into their design. The power line corridors would double as bike paths and nature corridors. Even the irrigation would be planned. The city would use reclaimed water on its greenery. Pereira's campus design itself was a statement of intent. He modeled it on Ebenezer Howard's Ring Plan Garden City, a circular central park ringed by 6 academic quadrangles, connected to the center by radiating pedestrian malls. An inner ring, half a mile in diameter, linked undergraduate teaching buildings. An outer ring connected the specialized research facilities. He proposed a town center with civic buildings and housing for 10,000 residents, linked to the campus entrance by a pedestrian bridge. It was idealistic, geometric, and, remarkably, it got built. Walk the UC Irvine campus today, and you can still see the wheel and spoke layout, still feel the influence of a man who believed that the shape of a place could shape the lives within it. Pereira called it a city of tomorrow. And the thing that made it possible, the thing that distinguished this plan from every other utopian sketch gathering dust in an architecture school, was that the Irvine Company owned all the land. There were no holdouts to buy out, no city councils to persuade, no neighborhood opposition to navigate. One company, one plan, one continuous piece of earth. The same characteristic that had made the ranch possible in 1864. Its wholeness, its refusal to fragment, now made the city possible a century later. There is a footnote to this era that captures the scale of the emptiness. In 1953, 7 years before the university deal, the Irvine Ranch had hosted the 3rd National Boy Scout Jamboree. 50,000 scouts descended on the open land, camping on fields that would later become Fashion Island. A plaque still marks the spot. That's how empty this place was in the mid-20th century. Its best use to the outside world was as a campground. In 1964, the campus site was dedicated. President Lyndon Johnson flew in. Governor Pat Brown was there. Daniel Aldrich, the founding chancellor, broke ground. The following year, in the fall of 1965, UC Irvine opened its doors to its first class of students. And within a year, the first residential village, University Park, was welcoming its first families. The houses were modern, clean-lined, influenced by the post and bean California modernism of Eichler and the Sea Ranch. Interior atriums brought light into living rooms. Greenbelts led to schools and local shops. It was handsome, quiet, deliberate, and almost startlingly empty. The 1970 census counted about 34,000 people in the area. Around them, in every direction, the lima bean fields still ran to the horizon. Then, one by one, the villages came. Turtle Rock, wrapping around the hills near the university. West Park, Irvine's first Mediterranean-style village, introducing coral-colored homes and terracotta tiles and palm trees. El Camino Real, Walnut, named for the groves that once made the area the walnut capital of the world. By 1970, 5 villages were complete, and on December 28, 1971, the residents of those communities voted to incorporate as a city. The city of Irvine came into existence not because a settlement had gradually grown into a town that gradually grew into a city. It was incorporated because a plan said it was time. The city was founded on a blueprint. The second major phase was Woodbridge, designed by landscape architect Peter Walker and the firm of Smith & Williams. It opened in 1975 on 1,800 acres of the ranch's broad valley floor, larger than any single previous village. Woodbridge took the planning concepts and expanded them. 2 artificial lakes, each crossed by wooden footbridges that gave the village its name. Beach clubs on the lake shores, a town center within walking distance of most homes, public paths along the water, private waterfront residences beside them, a 20-foot-high privet hedge ringing the entire village, walling it off from the arterial roads beyond. It was a self-contained world. You could walk your kids to school, bike to the grocery store, swim in a lake, and never touch a freeway. That was the promise, and Woodbridge delivered on it. The population surged. By 1980, Irvine had 62,000 residents. By 1990, 110,000. But here's the pivot that turns Irvine from a well-planned suburb into something genuinely unprecedented. In 1977, a federal law, the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which had taken years to enforce, finally forced the James Irvine Foundation to sell its controlling stake in the Irvine Company. Foundations, Congress had decided, could no longer hold majority positions in operating businesses. The Irvine Company went on the market, and the bidding was fierce. Mobil Corporation, the oil giant, put in an offer. Imagine that for a moment. One of the largest petroleum companies in the world trying to buy 100,000 acres of Southern California. They were outbid. The winning group was a consortium led by A. Alfred Taubman from Detroit. It included Henry Ford II. And it included a relatively quiet real estate developer from Orange County named Donald Bren. Bren paid in as a minority investor, contributing enough for a 34% stake. The total purchase price was $337.4 million, one of the largest private land acquisitions in California history. That number is important. Remember the $40,000 that James Irvine and his partners paid in the 1860s. A century later, the same land sold for over $300 million. And yet, in hindsight, even $337 million was absurdly cheap. Because Donald Bren understood something. Bren was the son of a Hollywood movie producer, but he'd grown up watching his father's real estate deals more closely than his film sets. After the University of Washington on a skiing scholarship, he'd tried for the 1956 Olympic team and missed it after an injury. And 3 years as a Marine Corps officer, he'd started building homes in 1958 at the age of 26. By 1963, he'd co-founded the Mission Viejo Company and master-planned an entire city of 10,000 acres south of the ranch. International paper had bought him out for $34 million in 1970. He bought himself back for $22 million during the recession 2 years later. The man knew how land worked. He knew that Southern California had one direction, growth, and that the Irvine Ranch, even partially developed, was not a piece of real estate. It was a machine for creating value that would never stop running, because the land was still whole, the plan was still intact, and the freeways that the California legislature had approved in 1959, 3 of them, now linked the ranch property directly to the entire Los Angeles metropolitan area. Over the next 6 years, as Taubman and Ford lost interest or needed liquidity, Bren steadily bought their shares. In 1983, he was elected chairman of the board and became majority owner. The immediate payout for Joan Irvine Smith's remaining family stake came to roughly $500 million. The company's total valuation had climbed to around $1 billion, tripling in 6 years. By 1996, Bren had purchased every remaining share. He was the sole owner of the Irvine Company. One man holding the same land that one man had held a century before. The pattern held. What Bren did next is what separates Irvine from every other master-planned community in American history. Reston, Virginia went bankrupt. Columbia, Maryland went bankrupt. Irvine never did. Bren ran the company with the patience of a farmer and the discipline of a Marine, which he was, having served as an officer after college. He set design standards that would make the most demanding homeowners association look casual. Every single-family home had to have windows on all 4 sides. Roofs required ceramic shingles or terracotta tiles. Each village received a plant palette, a list of exactly which trees, shrubs, and grasses were permitted. Bren himself has been known to drive around the city and direct his staff to redo landscaping or design details he found insufficient. He wasn't building houses to sell. He was building a place to hold. And hold he did. Unlike most developers who build and flip, Bren kept the commercial properties, the office buildings, the apartment complexes, the shopping centers. Today, the Irvine Company owns more than 590 office buildings, 125 apartment communities with 65,000 units, 40 shopping centers, 5 marinas, 3 golf courses, and a coastal resort. 129 million square feet of rentable space. The annual rental income alone is staggering, though the company, being private, does not release its financials. What we know is that Donald Bren's net worth, derived almost entirely from this one company and this one piece of land, sits at approximately $18 billion. He is the wealthiest real estate developer in America. He owns the MetLife building in Manhattan, and the core of his empire is still the same dirt that James Irvine bought from a desperate rancher during a drought. The city kept growing, and Bren kept building. Not just homes, but the commercial infrastructure that would fund everything else. In 1989, the Irvine Company completed 2 15-story office towers at the southeastern edge of the ranch, anchoring what would become the Irvine Spectrum Business District. Planning for the retail portion had begun in 1985, and in 1993, construction started on what was originally called the Entertainment Center at the Irvine Spectrum. It opened on November 22, 1995, a massive outdoor complex with Moorish revival architecture, a giant Ferris wheel, and a 21-screen Regal cinema. Sega opened its first-ever arcade venue there. The center now draws over 17 million visitors a year and has expanded through 6 phases over 3 decades. Meanwhile, on the other end of the company's holdings, Fashion Island was having its own second and third lives. It had opened in Newport Beach on September 9, 1967, the same year as the rival South Coast Plaza, 5 miles away in Costa Mesa, as a 75-acre, $20 million complex designed by Pereira and Welton Beckett, with parking for 5,500 cars. 18,000 people turned out for the opening night charity celebration. The original anchors were Robinson's, J.C. Penney, Buffum's, and the Broadway, names that evoke a vanished era of California department store culture. By the 2020s, those anchors had been replaced by Bloomingdale's, Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, and Macy's. The center had been renovated 4 times, most recently in a $100 million reinvestment that transformed its architecture and outdoor spaces. Its vacancy rate, in its entire 50-plus year history, has never gone above single digits. Fashion Island now draws 16 million visitors annually to 1.5 million square feet of retail. Its koi pond, 80 fish, 20,000 gallons, installed in 1969, remains one of the most photographed spots in Orange County. Between these 2 anchors, the city filled in, village after village, 22 of them now, each with its own architectural character, its own schools, its own parks. Northwood with its century-old eucalyptus windrows, West Park with its Mediterranean palette, Fortola Springs climbing the eastern hills. And then the base closed. Marine Corps Air Station El Toro had opened in November of 1942, built on what was then still lima bean fields at the edge of the ranch. The name came from a nearby settlement of about 130 people. Lieutenant Colonel William Fox had selected the site because the terrain was flat, the weather was clear, and the Irvine Company's land was available. For 57 years, fighter jets roared over southern Orange County during World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. The base covered 4,700 acres with 2 8,000-foot runways and 2 10,000-foot runways, capable of handling every aircraft in the military inventory. Its logo, a flying bull, had been designed by Walt Disney in 1944 and never changed. In 1950, El Toro was designated a permanent master jet station for Fleet Marine Forces Pacific. Several presidents, including Ronald Reagan, landed there when visiting Southern California. For many Marines heading to Vietnam, it was the last American soil they stood on. For some of them, it was also the last. In 1993, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission marked El Toro for shutdown. On July 2, 1999, MCAS El Toro officially closed, its operations transferred to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar near San Diego. And suddenly, nearly 5,000 acres of land in the middle of Irvine, surrounded by a 14,000-acre buffer zone that the military had maintained for noise liability, were available for the first time since the Second World War. What followed was one of the most contentious land use battles in Orange County history. One faction wanted to convert the base into a commercial airport. Its runways were already built, its infrastructure was in place. Northern Orange County wanted the convenience. Newport Beach residents hoped it might relieve pressure on John Wayne Airport. The opposing faction, led largely by the city of Irvine and the communities surrounding the base, wanted a park. The fight consumed county politics for years: ballot measures, lawsuits, dueling environmental studies. In 2001, Orange County voters passed Measure W, authorizing the former air station's conversion into a park and mixed-use development. The airport proposal died, and the Orange County Great Park was born, approved at a projected cost of $1.1 billion, intended to be the largest new municipal park built in California in a generation. 1,300 acres of it now sit where Marines once trained, and the surrounding land has been rezoned for housing, adding thousands of new residents to a city that was already growing at a pace that would have shocked William Pereira. The population numbers tell the story more starkly than anything else. In 1970, the year before incorporation, 34,000 people. In 1980, 62,000. In 1990, 110,000. In 2000, 143,000. In 2010, 212,000. In 2020, 307,000. That is a 900% increase in 50 years from a standing start. And unlike most cities that grow that fast, Irvine did not sprawl. It did not fragment. It did not descend into the usual American chaos of competing jurisdictions and overlapping strip malls. It grew on plan. By the 2000s, the tech industry had discovered what the land had to offer, and the discovery, it turned out, had roots going back to the very decision that created the city. UC Irvine's research parks and engineering programs had been spinning off companies since the 70s. But two founding stories from 1991 capture the moment when Irvine stopped being a suburb and started becoming something else. That year, Henry Samueli and Henry Nicholas, two engineers out of UCLA, founded Broadcom in Irvine, a semiconductor company that would grow into a global technology giant whose chips power the world's data centers and wireless networks. The same year, three UCLA graduates named Alan Adam, Michael Morheim, and Frank Pierce founded a small game studio they initially called Silicon and Synapse. They worked out of a cramped space in Irvine, building games for other publishers. The company changed its name a few times before settling on Blizzard Entertainment. Then they built World of Warcraft, and the world changed. Today, Blizzard's sprawling Irvine campus employs around 7,000 people. The company generated $5.7 billion in revenue in 2024. Its most famous products, Warcraft, Diablo, Overwatch, were conceived and built in a city that, when the company was founded, had barely 100,000 residents and was still surrounded by open land. CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity firm that made global headlines in 2024, established major operations in Irvine. Anduril Industries, the defense technology company founded in 2017 by Palmer Luckey, the man who invented the Oculus Rift virtual reality headset, before selling it to Facebook for $2 billion, chose Irvine for its headquarters, building AI-driven autonomous drones and surveillance systems. Anduril reached $1 billion in revenue in 2024 with roughly 3,500 employees. More than 17,000 companies now operate in the city, generating $28 billion annually. The average tech salary runs around $120,000. UC Irvine alone contributes over $5 billion to the regional economy, and in 2024, the federal government designated Irvine as an official tech hub, a formal acknowledgement of something the numbers had been saying for years. The $1-an-acre lima bean fields are producing value at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to every previous owner of the land. And then there's the safety record. For nearly 20 consecutive years, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report has ranked Irvine the safest large city in America, the lowest violent crime rate of any city with a population over 250,000. This is not an accident. It is, like everything else in Irvine, a product of design. The village structure creates what researchers call cohesion, residential neighborhoods placed away from major thoroughfares, well-lit streets, abundant parks and community centers, a police department that has been funded at levels most cities would envy, supported by the commercial tax base that the master plan deliberately created. The Irvine Company's commercial properties generate tens of millions of dollars in annual tax revenue for the city, which flows directly into services. The architecture of the plan is also the architecture of safety. But there is a question that the plan never quite answers, and it's the question that the audience for this story, the people who love the grand hotels and the busy commercial streets and the architecture built to last, will inevitably ask. Where is the surprise? Where is the jazz club that opened because the rent was cheap and the owner was a character? Where is the hotel lobby where deals were made over bourbon at midnight? Where is the building that shouldn't have worked but did? The block that evolved over a century from warehouse to gallery to restaurant row? Irvine has none of these things, and it was designed not to have them. Every tree is on a pallet. Every roof line is approved. Every village has its own character, but the character was chosen, not grown. The median home price in Irvine reached $1.42 million in 2024. The city is 68% more expensive than the national average. Its population is remarkably diverse, roughly 45% Asian American, 39% white, with significant communities from dozens of countries. It is, by every measurable standard, one of the most successful cities in the United States. It works. The schools are excellent. The parks are immaculate. The crime rate is vanishingly low. The economy is enormous. And the man who controls it all, Donald Bren, now 94 years old, still drives around occasionally to check that the landscaping meets his standards. He has donated over 57,000 acres of the original ranch to be preserved as permanent open space, more than half the total acreage, a gesture of conservation so large that it would be a landmark act even if it came from the federal government, let alone a single private landowner. There's a spot in the Irvine Ranch natural landmarks where you can stand and see in one unbroken sweep the preserved wilderness running from the coastal mountains to the sea. There's no development in sight. The grass and scrub look almost exactly like what James Irvine would have seen when he first rode onto this land in the 1860s, or close to it anyway. Behind you, to the north and west, 300,000 people live in 22 villages designed by teams of architects and planners who spent decades thinking about how wide a green belt should be and which direction a living room window should face. The land is both empty and full. It is the most carefully controlled, significant piece of real estate in the United States, simultaneously preserved and monetized, wild and manicured, governed by a single vision and inhabited by people from every corner of the world. William Pereira, who started all of this by standing on a hilltop above the bean fields, once said something that the Irvine Company likes to quote. If 100 years from now the campus and its community still look as we picture them in our master plan, we shall have, in a sense, failed. He meant that good planning should allow for evolution, for surprise, for the kind of change that no planner can predict. He died in 1985, 20 years into the experiment. Whether Irvine has fulfilled his hope or his fear depends on what you believe a city is for. The bean fields are gone, every last acre of them. Where they were, there are now office towers and apartment complexes and bike paths and artificial lakes and $10 million homes with terracotta roofs and windows on all four sides. The Irvine Historical Museum, the oldest standing structure within the original ranch boundaries, built in 1868 when James Irvine I needed somewhere to stay during his visits, sits in the middle of a city that didn't exist when the last lima bean was harvested. It's a small building. The land around it is worth more per square foot than most downtown districts in America. $18,000, 108,000 acres, $1, 337 million, 18 billion. The numbers tell one story, the land tells another. And the city, Irvine, California, population 318,000, safe and planned and humming with commerce, the most improbable city in America. The city tells a third story, one that isn't finished yet, one that may never look quite the way anyone imagined. Because that's the thing about land. You can plan everything on it. You can control everything about it. You can design the windows and the roof lines and the plant palettes and the bicycle corridors. But you can't design what the people who live there will remember, or what they'll miss, or what they'll wish for in a moment of quiet, standing at the edge of a greenbelt as the sun drops behind the Santa Ana Mountains and the last light catches the curve of a road that someone 60 years ago drew on a piece of paper and said, "Here, put it here."